The most dangerous mistake a Marine can make is assuming he already knows who deserves respect. The lunch crowd inside Harborview Diner buzzed with the easy conversations of civilians, retired service members, and off-duty Marines enjoying one quiet afternoon just outside the gates of Camp Pendleton. Outside, rows of American flags stirred gently beneath a warm Pacific breeze, while the distant rumble of helicopters drifted across the clear California sky, blending into the familiar rhythm of the base that never truly slept. At the corner booth beside the front window sat an elderly man who looked too ordinary to earn a second glance. His faded olive jacket had been carefully folded across the empty seat beside him. His weathered ball cap rested neatly on the table, and a chipped white coffee mug warmed both of his hands. 81-year-old Thomas Walker carried himself with the kind of effortless posture that never disappeared after decades of military discipline, though nothing about his appearance suggested he expected anyone to notice. His silver hair was neatly trimmed, deep lines framed calm blue eyes, and the faint smile on his face belonged to someone completely at peace with being forgotten. The waitress, Linda Harper, had served him enough times to know he always ordered exactly the same breakfast, always tipped generously, and always thanked every employee by name before quietly leaving. To everyone else, he was simply another retired old man spending his morning near the base. The front door swung open with a cheerful chime as 4 young Marines entered, laughing loudly about the morning's field exercises. Their crisp camouflage uniforms, polished boots, and unmistakable confidence instantly drew attention from several diners. Sergeant Ethan Brooks led the group with the relaxed swagger of a Marine who had recently earned his promotion and believed experience belonged to those still wearing the uniform. Beside him walked Corporal Noah Reed, quieter but equally amused by whatever joke had filled the parking lot moments earlier. They ordered burgers, exchanged playful insults with the cashier, and searched the room for an empty table. Ethan's eyes stopped on Thomas just as the old veteran reached for his coffee. The sleeve of Thomas's flannel shirt slid slightly above his wrist, revealing a faded black tattoo that wrapped around his forearm. Age had blurred the lines, but one detail remained unmistakable. A serpent formed a perfect circle around a simple 5-pointed star. Ethan slowed to a stop, nudged Noah with his elbow, and tilted his head toward the old man. "You seeing that?" he asked with a grin. Noah glanced over, shrugged, then smirked. "Looks like somebody wanted to look special 50 years too late." The other Marines chuckled quietly. Ethan stepped closer, curiosity quickly giving way to amusement. "Hey, Grandpa," he called across the diner loud enough for nearby tables to hear. Thomas looked up calmly, meeting the young Marine's eyes without the slightest hint of irritation. "That's an interesting tattoo you've got there." Thomas simply nodded once. "It has been with me a long time." Ethan laughed, folding his arms. "Funny. I've spent 8 years around Marines, and I've never seen anything like that. Guess they hand those out at the costume shop now." A few customers looked down at their plates while others exchanged uncomfortable glances. Linda paused beside the coffee machine, sensing the tone shift inside the diner. Thomas remained completely still. He neither defended himself nor challenged the young Marine standing over him. He simply wrapped both hands around his coffee mug again, as though the conversation carried no weight at all. Ethan mistook the silence for embarrassment and smiled wider. "Come on," he said. "At least tell us what secret unit that's supposed to be. Or are we looking at the latest version of stolen valor?" Around the diner, the laughter grew just loud enough to echo off the windows, but Thomas Walker answered only with quiet eyes that had already witnessed more than anyone in that room could possibly imagine. Thomas let the last traces of laughter drift through the diner without chasing them away. Years had taught him that silence often revealed far more about a person than arguments ever could. He lifted his coffee, took one slow sip, and placed the mug back onto its saucer with steady hands that never trembled. The tiny porcelain click echoed across the room with surprising clarity. Sergeant Ethan Brooks waited for some kind of reaction, perhaps an angry denial or an elaborate story, but none came. The old veteran simply looked at him with calm eyes that carried neither resentment nor fear. That quiet composure irritated Ethan far more than any sharp reply could have. "Nothing to say?" he asked, leaning closer with a crooked smile. Most people trying to impress Marines usually have a speech ready. Thomas answered in a voice so even that several nearby customers instinctively stopped talking to listen. Some stories belong to the people who live them. Ethan chuckled and glanced back at the other Marines. Convenient answer. Corporal Noah Reed folded his arms and stepped beside his sergeant. Maybe he found the design online. Everybody likes pretending they were part of something secret these days. Another round of laughter spread across the room, softer than before, but still loud enough to draw uneasy looks from families eating lunch nearby. Linda Harper slowly carried a fresh pot of coffee toward Thomas's table. She smiled gently as she refilled his mug. "Anything else for you today, Mr. Walker?" she asked. "No, thank you, Linda. Everything is perfect." His answer was warm, polite, and completely untouched by the tension surrounding him. Linda lingered for only a second before returning toward the counter. Yet something about Thomas's expression stayed with her. He did not look embarrassed. He did not even look uncomfortable. He looked like a man patiently waiting for a storm to finish passing overhead because he had already survived countless others. Ethan noticed the waitress using Thomas's name and pointed toward the faded tattoo again. "Mr. Walker, huh? Then maybe Mr. Walker can explain what that symbol actually means." Thomas glanced down at the worn black ink circling his forearm. Time had softened every line until the serpent almost disappeared into weathered skin, but the small star at its center remained visible beneath decades of sun and age. He rested one fingertip lightly against it, almost absent-mindedly, as though greeting an old friend instead of displaying a mark. "It reminds me of people I promised never to forget," he said quietly. Noah gave an exaggerated nod. "That sounds dramatic." Ethan leaned against the edge of the booth. "Funny thing is, I have spent years studying Marine history. I have never seen that symbol on any official unit roster." Thomas looked back at him. "I would not expect you to." The answer was delivered without arrogance or challenge, yet it somehow unsettled the confidence behind Ethan's smile. Before he could think about why, another Marine reached forward with a playful grin. Lance Corporal Mason Carter had remained mostly silent until now, content to watch the exchange unfold. "Maybe the ink is fading because it was never real in the first place," he joked. Without asking permission, he reached toward Thomas's forearm as if intending to rub the tattoo with his thumb. Linda stopped halfway across the dining room, carrying a tray of sandwiches. Something deep inside her urged her to tell him not to touch the old man's arm, although she could not have explained why. Several customers instinctively looked up from their meals. Even Noah hesitated for the briefest moment. Thomas made no effort to pull away. He simply watched the younger Marine's hand approach with the same patient expression he had worn since the conversation began. Outside the large front window, the afternoon breeze stirred the flags lining the road toward the base, while the distant sound of helicopter rotors rolled across the California sky. Somewhere far beyond the diner, a memory that had remained silent for more than half a century seemed ready to awaken the instant unfamiliar fingers came within inches of the faded mark that only two living men still carried. Lance Corporal Mason Carter's fingers stopped only an inch from the faded tattoo before finally making contact with the weathered skin of Thomas Walker's forearm. He rubbed the mark once with his thumb, expecting cheap ink to smear across the old man's arm or reveal some modern stencil underneath. Nothing changed. The black serpent remained exactly where it had rested for decades, faded by time, but permanently etched beneath the surface. Mason frowned slightly and rubbed harder. The symbol did not move. It did not fade. It simply remained, quiet and unyielding, like the man wearing it. A few Marines laughed again, although this time the laughter sounded forced, as though they were trying to convince themselves they were still in control of the situation. Ethan Brooks crossed his arms with another confident grin. "Well, at least whoever gave you that tattoo knew what they were doing." Thomas slowly lowered his eyes toward Mason's hand still resting on his arm. His voice remained calm, almost gentle. That mark was never meant to impress anyone. Mason finally withdrew his hand, shrugging as if the moment meant nothing. "Looks real enough," he admitted. "Still does not make the story real." Thomas nodded once. "Fair enough." The answer carried no frustration, no attempt to persuade, no demand to be believed. That unexpected restraint unsettled Noah Reed far more than any dramatic speech could have. He had met veterans who proudly displayed photographs, medals, certificates, and unit patches within minutes of introducing themselves. Thomas had done none of those things. He simply accepted disbelief without the slightest need to defend his past. Around the diner, conversations resumed quietly, but many customers continued watching from the corners of their eyes. Linda Harper stood behind the counter pretending to organize coffee cups while secretly studying the old veteran. She remembered something her late father, himself a retired Navy chief, had once told her. The men who had done the hardest jobs rarely volunteered stories about them. They usually spent their energy avoiding attention instead. That memory settled uncomfortably in her mind as she looked back toward Thomas. Ethan leaned forward again, determined to have the final word. "You know what I think?" he asked. "I think people see a military town and figure wearing old gear and mysterious tattoos earns free respect." Thomas met his eyes without hesitation. Respect given freely is not worth very much. Ethan blinked, caught off guard by the answer. Before he could respond, Thomas added, quietly, "Respect earned over a lifetime does not disappear because someone fails to recognize it." The words lingered over the table long after he finished speaking. Noah shifted his weight, suddenly less certain that continuing the conversation felt entertaining. Mason glanced toward the diner windows, avoiding Thomas's eyes altogether. Even Ethan noticed the room had grown strangely quiet. Outside, a convoy of military utility vehicles rolled past the entrance toward the base, their engines humming steadily beneath the afternoon sun. The sound faded almost as quickly as it arrived, leaving only the gentle clink of silverware and the distant cry of gulls drifting inland from the Pacific. Linda reached beneath the counter and picked up her phone without attracting attention. She hesitated, staring once more at the faded serpent surrounding the small five-pointed star. She could not explain why the image seemed strangely familiar. Then she remembered an old photograph she had once seen hanging in her father's study. It had shown several much younger officers standing beside an admiral during a retirement ceremony. One sleeve had been rolled up just enough to reveal what looked remarkably similar to the same circular design. Her pulse quickened. She quietly searched through her contacts until she found the number of her nephew, Petty Officer First Class Daniel Harper, who worked at Fleet Intelligence on the nearby naval installation. She stepped into the hallway beside the kitchen, lowered her voice, and waited for him to answer. "Daniel," she said carefully after the line connected, "this is going to sound unusual, but I need you to tell me if you have ever seen a faded tattoo of a serpent wrapped around a five-pointed star." The silence that followed lasted several long seconds before his calm voice answered with unexpected seriousness. "Aunt Linda," he said slowly, "where exactly are you calling from?" Daniel Harper did not answer Linda's question immediately. She could hear keyboards clicking in the background and distant voices moving through what sounded like a secure operations office. When he finally spoke again, his tone had changed completely. "Aunt Linda," he said carefully, "I need you to describe exactly what you are looking at. Every detail matters." Linda glanced toward the dining room, where Thomas Walker remained quietly seated with both hands around his coffee mug, while the young Marines continued talking among themselves. She lowered her voice even further. "It is on the outside of his left forearm. A faded black serpent forming a complete circle around a simple five-pointed star. The lines are worn from age, but the shape is unmistakable." The silence on the other end stretched longer this time. "How old is the man?" Daniel finally asked. "Early 80s, I think." Another pause followed. "Is he acting upset?" Linda looked through the narrow kitchen window. Thomas appeared completely relaxed, occasionally watching the sunlight reflect across the diner windows as though he had nowhere else to be. "No," she answered. "Honestly, he seems like the calmest person in the room." Daniel drew a slow breath. "Do not ask him any more questions. Do not mention this call. Stay on the line." Linda heard a chair scrape sharply across the floor before footsteps hurried away from the phone. Confused, she remained exactly where she was. Out in the dining room, Thomas rested one finger lightly against the faded tattoo. The simple touch carried him somewhere no one else could follow. For a brief moment, the sounds of plates and conversations dissolved into another time entirely. Warm California sunlight gave way to dense jungle shadows, where heavy morning mist drifted between towering trees. The damp scent of earth mixed with aviation fuel carried by distant rotor blades. 5 young men stood shoulder to shoulder without rank displayed on their uniforms, their sleeves rolled above their elbows as an older officer quietly inspected the fresh black symbols newly inked onto each forearm. No speeches had been given. No photographers had recorded the moment. There had only been one sentence spoken in a calm voice that every man remembered for the rest of his life. If history never remembers your names, remember each other. The memory lingered only a heartbeat before fading back into the present. Thomas blinked once and returned to the quiet afternoon inside Harborview Diner. Across the room, Ethan Brooks noticed the old veteran staring at the tattoo again and mistook the distant expression for regret. "Still thinking of the story?" he asked with a smirk. Thomas looked up peacefully. "I was thinking of friends." Ethan shrugged. "You really commit to the part." Noah Reed remained silent. Something about the old man's answers no longer felt rehearsed. Every response had been remarkably simple, almost understated, as though Thomas deliberately avoided making himself sound important. That humility did not fit the image Noah had expected from someone supposedly inventing military history. Before he could sort through the uneasy feeling growing in his mind, Linda's phone suddenly crackled again. Daniel's voice returned, noticeably quieter than before. "Aunt Linda, I checked the open historical database. There is nothing there. I checked restricted unit references that I am authorized to access. There is still nothing there. That symbol should not exist." Linda frowned. "Then why do you sound like you know exactly what it is?" Daniel hesitated before answering. "Because about 3 years ago, I attended an internal leadership briefing. One slide appeared for less than 5 seconds before it was removed. It showed the exact same serpent surrounding the same star. The instructor skipped past it immediately and told everyone in the room that if they ever encountered that symbol outside official archives, they were to notify command without delay." Linda felt the hairs on the back of her neck rise. "Are you saying this old gentleman is connected to that briefing?" Daniel answered with complete seriousness. "I am saying I cannot explain why he would have that tattoo, but I can tell you this. I am already forwarding this information to my commanding officer, and if that symbol means what I think it does, someone much higher than me is going to care very, very soon." Daniel ended the call without another word. Linda lowered her phone slowly, her heartbeat noticeably faster than it had been only minutes earlier. She looked through the kitchen doorway toward Thomas Walker again, but now the elderly customer no longer appeared to be just another retired veteran enjoying a quiet afternoon. Whatever that faded symbol represented, someone inside Fleet Intelligence had recognized it immediately, and that realization settled heavily in her mind. She returned to the dining room carrying a fresh pot of coffee, moving with deliberate calm so that nothing about her behavior would attract attention. Thomas noticed her approaching and offered the same gentle smile he had given her every Tuesday for nearly 3 years. "May I warm that up for you?" Linda asked. "I would appreciate that," Thomas replied. She carefully refilled his mug before quietly placing a slice of homemade apple pie in front of him. Thomas looked up with mild surprise. "I did not order this." Linda smiled softly. "Today it is on the house." Thomas hesitated only briefly before nodding gratefully. "Thank you, Linda." Across the room, Ethan Brooks noticed the exchange and laughed. "Looks like the sympathy campaign is working." Mason Carter smirked. "Maybe mysterious tattoos come with free dessert." A few Marines laughed again, but Noah Reed remained unusually quiet. He had begun paying closer attention to the old veteran instead of the jokes surrounding him. Thomas had not accepted the pie with the satisfaction of someone enjoying attention. If anything, he looked faintly uncomfortable receiving special treatment. Noah had seen enough experienced Marines to recognize quiet confidence when it stood in front of him, and something about Thomas reminded him of senior instructors who never raised their voices because they never needed to. Linda returned behind the counter and continued serving customers while replaying Daniel's words over and over inside her head. "That symbol should not exist. Someone much higher than me is going to care very soon." Those sentences refused to leave her thoughts. Several miles away, inside Fleet Intelligence headquarters overlooking the harbor, Daniel Harper stood outside his commanding officer's office holding a printed sketch of the serpent surrounding the 5-pointed star. Commander Stephen Mercer accepted the page without visible emotion. He studied the drawing for several seconds before his eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. "Who drew this?" he asked. "My aunt described it over the phone, sir." "Where?" Daniel answered immediately. "Harborview Diner outside Camp Pendleton." The commander's expression remained controlled, but he reached for his secure telephone instead of asking another question. He entered a short identification code, waited for the encrypted connection, and spoke only one sentence. Possible live visual confirmation of Ouroboros designation. Elderly male. Harborview Diner. Verification requested. He ended the call and looked back at Daniel. You will not discuss this with anyone. No, sir. Not your coworkers. No, sir. Not your family. Daniel hesitated only because he had already spoken to Linda. Understood, sir. Commander Mercer folded the sketch carefully instead of throwing it away. If this report is accurate, the decision is no longer ours. Back inside the diner, nothing appeared different. Families continued eating lunch. The television above the counter quietly replayed sports highlights. Outside, the afternoon sunlight reflected across parked pickup trucks and motorcycles lined beside the curb. Thomas slowly cut a small piece of apple pie and tasted it with the same peaceful expression he had worn all afternoon. Ethan watched him from across the room, convinced the old man had simply become the center of an amusing story that would be forgotten before evening. Thomas looked toward the front window where the American flag continued moving gently in the coastal breeze. For just a moment, his eyes reflected a quiet sadness that had nothing to do with the Marines surrounding him. There had once been 5 men who carried that same mark beneath their sleeves. Year after year, that number had become 4, then 3, until only 2 remained. He quietly whispered words so softly that only he could hear them. I hope you boys found your peace. None of the young Marines noticed the sentence, but somewhere far beyond the diner, a secure telephone began ringing inside the office of Admiral Robert Callahan. The secure telephone rang only twice before Admiral Robert Callahan answered. His office overlooked San Diego Bay, where gray warships rested beneath the bright afternoon sun, their silhouettes sharp against the calm Pacific water. The meeting around the conference table immediately fell silent as the Admiral listened without interrupting. Senior officers watched his expression carefully, but the seasoned commander revealed almost nothing. He simply leaned back, rested one hand against the polished wood of the table, and allowed the report to continue. Finally, he asked a single question. Are you absolutely certain about the description? The answer arrived immediately through the encrypted line. Admiral Callahan lowered his eyes for several long seconds before quietly repeating the words that had just reached him. A faded serpent surrounding a 5-pointed star on the left forearm. The room remained completely still. One rear admiral exchanged a puzzled glance with the Marine general seated beside him, but neither spoke. Callahan slowly stood. Cancel the remainder of this briefing. Several officers looked surprised. The discussion they had been conducting involved fleet readiness and had been scheduled for weeks. Sir, one captain asked cautiously. Callahan buttoned his service jacket with deliberate movements. This meeting is over. His executive officer immediately recognized the tone. There was no room for debate. Chairs slid quietly across the floor as the assembled officers rose. The Admiral turned toward his executive officer. Prepare transportation immediately. Destination, sir? Harborview Diner outside Camp Pendleton. The younger officer blinked in confusion. Yes, Admiral. No press. Understood. No ceremonial escort. Understood. Callahan paused before adding one final instruction. Notify no one at the destination. I want the situation exactly as it is when we arrive. The executive officer nodded once and disappeared into the hallway at a brisk pace. Within moments, activity spread across headquarters with remarkable efficiency. Drivers were notified. Security personnel quietly assembled. Communications officers rerouted schedules without explanation. No one below the highest clearance level understood why a routine afternoon had suddenly become a priority movement. Meanwhile, inside Harborview Diner, the atmosphere remained almost unchanged. Ethan Brooks had shifted the conversation toward training exercises, convinced the encounter with the elderly veteran had already run its course. Mason Carter laughed while describing an obstacle course competition from the previous week, but Noah Reed contributed very little. His attention drifted back toward Thomas more often than he realized. The old veteran ate his slice of pie slowly, pausing once to watch a little girl near the front counter carefully help her younger brother choose a cookie from the display case. Thomas smiled warmly as the children thanked Linda before returning to their parents. That simple smile struck Noah more deeply than he expected. It carried none of the bitterness he might have anticipated from someone who had spent the last half hour being questioned and mocked. Instead, it reflected quiet patience, the kind Noah remembered seeing in his grandfather during difficult family moments years earlier. Outside the diner, sunlight shimmered across chrome bumpers and motorcycle tanks, while a steady coastal breeze carried the distant scent of salt water inland. Traffic moved normally along the road leading toward the base entrance. Nothing suggested that anything unusual was unfolding. Yet nearly 15 miles away, a convoy of dark government sport utility vehicles rolled through a secured gate without slowing. Military police snapped to attention as the lead vehicle passed. Inside the rear passenger seat, Admiral Robert Callahan sat in complete silence. Resting across his lap was an old leather folder that showed decades of careful use. He opened it only once during the drive. Inside rested a faded photograph protected beneath clear plastic. 5 young men stood shoulder to shoulder beneath tropical sunlight, none wearing visible rank insignia, each smiling with the confidence of youth. Their sleeves were rolled above their elbows. On every left forearm appeared the same serpent surrounding the same 5-pointed star. Callahan allowed himself one quiet breath before gently touching the face of the man, standing at the center of the photograph. Beneath the image, written in fading ink, were only 5 words. Thomas Walker, never leave a brother. The convoy covered the final miles in complete silence. No flashing lights announced its approach. No sirens cleared the road. Only a line of dark government sport utility vehicles moved steadily through the afternoon traffic with quiet purpose, drawing little attention from passing drivers who assumed another routine military movement was underway. Inside the lead vehicle, Admiral Robert Callahan closed the worn leather folder and rested one hand upon it, as though protecting something far more valuable than paper. His executive officer glanced over from the front passenger seat. "Sir, Fleet Intelligence has confirmed there have been no disturbances at the location." Callahan nodded once. "Good. Would you like local command notified before we arrive?" "No." The answer came immediately. Some lessons are better witnessed exactly as they unfold. Back at Harborview Diner, Ethan Brooks checked the time on his watch and stood from his chair. "We should probably get moving." Mason Carter stretched and reached for his tray. "Give me another minute." Noah Reed remained seated, still watching Thomas Walker from across the room. The elderly veteran had finished only half of his pie. He seemed to enjoy every bite without the slightest hurry, occasionally looking through the front window toward the rows of American flags lining the entrance road to Camp Pendleton. The peaceful expression on his face contrasted so sharply with everything that had happened that Noah finally found himself asking a quiet question. "Mr. Walker?" Thomas looked over with the same calm smile. "Yes." Noah hesitated before speaking. "Why did you never get angry?" Ethan laughed before Thomas could answer. "Because he knows we caught him." Noah ignored the interruption. Thomas considered the question for a moment before answering. "Because anger usually teaches the wrong lesson." Noah frowned slightly. "Even when someone is disrespectful?" Thomas nodded gently. "Especially then." Those simple words lingered in the room with unexpected weight. "Linda." Harper noticed Noah slowly looking down at his own hands as though reconsidering something he had believed only minutes earlier. Before anyone spoke again, the soft chime above the diner's entrance sounded as another customer entered. An elderly retired Navy chief removed his cap, nodded politely toward Linda, and quietly took a seat near the counter. His eyes drifted across the room before stopping on Thomas Walker. The older sailor stared for several seconds, not with recognition, but with the unmistakable feeling that he had seen something familiar long ago. Thomas acknowledged him with a polite nod, and the retired chief instinctively returned it with unusual respect. Outside, several customers glanced through the front windows after noticing unfamiliar black vehicles turning onto the side street leading toward the diner. They rolled forward at an unhurried pace before stopping neatly along the curb. Their engines idled quietly. The doors remained closed. Ethan noticed them and shrugged. Probably another command meeting somewhere on base. Mason barely looked outside. Happens every week. Linda, however, felt her heartbeat quicken. Daniel's warning echoed through her mind. Someone much higher than me is going to care very soon. One by one, the vehicle doors opened. Men wearing immaculate service uniforms stepped onto the sidewalk with practiced precision. They were not armed patrols. They were command security personnel. Their movements were calm, disciplined, and remarkably coordinated. Without raising their voices, they positioned themselves near the entrance, quietly scanning the area before stepping aside. Conversations inside the diner gradually faded. Even customers who had no military background sensed something unusual unfolding. Ethan stopped speaking in mid-sentence. Noah slowly turned toward the front door. Mason quietly lowered the paper cup in his hand. Through the glass, another vehicle came to a gentle stop directly in front of the entrance. The rear passenger door opened. A polished black shoe touched the pavement, followed by the unmistakable dark blue trousers bearing 4 rows of gold braid. The figure rose slowly into view, adjusting the front of a perfectly pressed service jacket as afternoon sunlight reflected from 4 silver stars resting upon each shoulder. No one inside the diner moved. Admiral Robert Callahan stood for a brief moment beside the vehicle, his gaze fixed through the front window until it settled upon one quiet, elderly man calmly sitting beside a half-finished slice of apple pie. Without acknowledging anyone else, the Admiral began walking toward the entrance. The bell above the diner's entrance chimed once, then fell silent. Every conversation stopped as Admiral Robert Callahan stepped inside with measured confidence, followed several paces behind by members of his command security detail. None of them spoke. None of them looked around the room. Their attention remained fixed on a single destination. The polished black shoes of the Admiral echoed softly across the tiled floor as he walked between the tables, passing stunned customers and motionless Marines without acknowledging anyone. Sergeant Ethan Brooks instinctively straightened his posture. Mason Carter immediately stepped aside. Noah Reed felt his pulse quicken as the highest-ranking naval officer he had ever seen walked directly past him without so much as a glance. Thomas Walker remained seated exactly as before, one hand resting beside his coffee mug, the other near the empty dessert plate. Only when the Admiral stopped beside his table did Thomas slowly raise his eyes. For one long heartbeat, neither man spoke. The room became so quiet that the distant cry of seagulls outside seemed impossibly loud. Then Admiral Callahan clicked his heels together with perfect precision and came to the sharpest position of attention anyone in the diner had ever witnessed. Without hesitation, he rendered a flawless military salute to the elderly man seated before him. Gasps rippled through the room. Ethan felt every confident thought he had carried into the diner collapse at once. Mason stared without blinking. Noah's mouth fell slightly open as he watched the impossible unfold before his eyes. Admiral Callahan held the salute several seconds before lowering his hand with unmistakable respect. His voice, when he finally spoke, carried warmth rarely heard from senior commanders. "Mr. Walker," he said quietly, "it has been far too many years." Thomas smiled with gentle familiarity. "You finally learned to stop making people wait, Robert." A faint smile crossed the Admiral's face. "Only because you taught me patience first." Several customers exchanged confused looks. The security personnel remained perfectly still, their expressions disciplined but unmistakably respectful. Admiral Callahan slowly turned away from Thomas and faced the Marines standing only a few feet away. His calm expression did not harden. If anything, it became even quieter. "Which one of you questioned this gentleman's tattoo?" No one answered immediately. Ethan swallowed before stepping forward. "Sir, I did." The Admiral regarded him for a long moment without raising his voice. "You believed the symbol was meaningless." Ethan struggled to answer. I thought it was not authentic, sir." Callahan nodded once. "I understand." Then, with slow and deliberate movements, he unbuttoned the cuff of his left sleeve. Every pair of eyes inside the diner followed the motion. He rolled the fabric upward past his wrist, then higher along his forearm until the skin beneath became fully visible. A collective breath swept across the room. There, unmistakably clear despite being decades newer than Thomas's, rested the identical black serpent forming a perfect circle around the same 5-pointed star. The two tattoos matched in every detail. No one spoke. Even the clatter from the kitchen had stopped. Admiral Callahan allowed the silence to settle before lowering his arm beside Thomas's. The matching symbols rested only inches apart, one faded by more than half a century, the other preserved with sharper lines but carrying the same unmistakable identity. The Admiral looked back toward the young Marines. You wondered what this mark represents. His voice remained calm enough that everyone leaned forward to hear each word. It is not the insignia of a famous unit. You will not find it in public records. You will not study it at any military academy. Some traditions are carried by memory instead of paper. He glanced toward Thomas with unmistakable admiration before continuing. Long before I wore these stars, before I ever commanded a ship or a fleet, I wore that symbol beside one man who taught me that the strongest leaders rarely introduced themselves by telling people who they were. They showed it through quiet service. Ethan lowered his eyes. Noah stood frozen. Mason felt every careless joke replay inside his mind with growing regret. Thomas simply reached for his coffee once more, as though none of the attention surrounding him had ever been the reason he came to Harbor View Diner at all. For several quiet moments, no one inside Harbor View Diner dared to speak. Admiral Robert Callahan slowly lowered his sleeve, covering the familiar symbol once again before turning his full attention back to Thomas Walker. His expression softened with unmistakable gratitude. Everything I became in this uniform, he said calmly, began because one man refused to leave another behind when every reason said he should. He looked toward the young Marines once more. The tattoo you questioned was never created to earn admiration. It was created so that the few men who survived would always recognize one another if fate ever brought them together again. Thomas gave the slightest shake of his head. Robert, they do not need the whole story. The Admiral smiled respectfully. No, sir. They only need the part that matters. He faced Ethan Brooks directly. You judged a man before learning his character. Every Marine will make mistakes. The important question is whether you learn from them. Ethan felt the weight of every careless word he had spoken that afternoon. He stepped forward until he stood beside Thomas's table, removed his cover, and looked the elderly veteran in the eyes. Mr. Walker, I owe you an apology. I assumed things that I had no right to assume. I spoke without respect, and I was wrong. Mason Carter immediately followed. I was wrong too, sir. Noah Reed had already removed his cover before either of them finished speaking. I am sorry, Mr. Walker. I should have stopped the conversation instead of standing there. Thomas looked at each young Marine in turn. There was no anger in his eyes, only quiet understanding earned through a lifetime of experience. All of you are still learning, he said gently. That never stops. The day you believe you already know everything about another person is the day you stop growing. Ethan nodded slowly. I will remember that. Thomas smiled. Good. Then today was worth something. Linda Harper quietly wiped away a tear before anyone noticed. Even the retired Navy chief near the counter stood and offered Thomas a respectful nod. Several civilians who had witnessed the entire encounter instinctively rose to their feet, not because anyone instructed them to, but because the moment itself seemed to deserve it. Admiral Callahan turned toward the room. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for allowing an old debt of gratitude to be honored today. He then looked back at Thomas. Would you allow me the privilege of walking you outside? Thomas chuckled softly. You always did ask permission before giving orders. The Admiral laughed for the first time that afternoon. Some habits are worth keeping. Together they walked toward the entrance at an unhurried pace. No cameras flashed. No speeches followed. The command security detail simply opened the door and stepped aside. Outside, the late afternoon sun bathed the parking lot in warm golden light, while the American flags along the roadside continued to sway gently in the ocean breeze. Before stepping away, Admiral Callahan extended his hand. Thomas accepted it, but the Admiral quietly pulled him into a brief embrace instead. It is good to see you again, he said. Likewise, Robert. Thomas picked up his folded jacket, adjusted his old ball cap, and started walking toward his weathered pickup truck. He did not look back. He did not wait for applause. He simply drove away as quietly as he had arrived, leaving behind nothing except a lesson that would stay with everyone who had witnessed it. Ethan remained standing beside the diner entrance long after the truck disappeared down the road. He glanced once more toward the flags moving in the breeze and finally understood that true honor was rarely announced, rarely displayed, and almost never demanded. It was carried quietly by people whose greatest achievements were often known only to those who had walked beside them. And somewhere beneath two rolled-down sleeves, identical symbols remained hidden once again, not because they needed to be seen, but because the men who wore them had never lived for recognition. They had lived for each other.